Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Can't complain. There are some unsettling world events that are relevant to the conversation we're about to have. Let me introduce us first. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Stephen Ward. You're a professor at Cambridge University in England. You've written a book that we're going to talk about called Status and the Challenge of Rising Powers. And does it have a subtitle?
No subtitle.
No subtitle, because it's a clear and explicit and descriptive title.
This was my editor.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, we'll if we have time to do a shop talk about publishing, we can do that at the end. But I think first we want, and your editor's at Cambridge University Press, right?
He's the guy at Cambridge University Press.
So your book, I want to talk about various aspects of it. It's relevant to various contemporary issues. And then there are historical cases in the book that I hope we'll have time to talk about. But I wanted to start out talking about events that are unfortunately unfolding in Ukraine. As we speak, a full-fledged invasion is underway. It's only no more than 24 hours old as we record this, but it's pretty clear, we're talking about a war here. Now, a common view of international relations that's very relevant to the Ukraine thing, but is not your view, and I want to contrast your view with this, is realism. Okay. So according to realism, we should view the behavior of states as, they're rational actors. They have their national security interests, and you should appraise their behavior that way. And I should say that realists, have a not bad track record with respect to Ukraine, in the sense that kind of maybe one of the best known realists, John Mearsheimer, has been warning for a long time, do not do the NATO expansion thing. It's going to drive them crazy. And not maybe in so many words, but, so they haven't done badly. But you, and I'm sure you attribute certainly some significance to considerations of national security, but you have this really interesting take that I think is relevant not only to what is happening in Ukraine, but to some much discussed features in the run-up to it, including Vladimir Putin's presentation of self, kind of. I mean, his speech not long before kind of freaked people out. And I think people would say, look, this isn't the real, the realists cannot accommodate this. This guy is like, he is not coolly moving pieces on a chessboard here. He seems pretty wrought up over this. So I just would like to start out by asking you, and we haven't talked about this. I don't really know exactly what your views are, but I assume you've been processing this whole thing in a slightly different way, because you emphasize, and tell me if I've got this right, that status, kind of the status psychology of states matters. States, like people, want respect. And if they don't get it, that can affect their behavior. So I think, why don't you start by just fleshing out the argument in the book, just briefly, to make sure we've got that part right, and then we can apply it to Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Yeah, so I think you have it basically right. Although here's what I'll do. I'll sort of broadly talk about how status might matter for foreign policy. The argument in my book is, I think it might apply to what's going on with Russia and Ukraine right now. Then again, I'm very cautious about, it's ongoing, and it'll be decades before we're able to actually figure this out. So you're basically right here, right? So the argument in the book is rooted in social psychology, specifically largely in social identity theory. And the idea here is that people care about the status of groups with which they identify. So, I care about the Oakland A's and I care about the San Francisco 49ers. And we also care about the states or countries that we identify with too, and we care about their status. And we might think that leaders especially care about the status of countries that they identify with, but domestic audiences do too, at least certain domestic audiences. And there's a massive body of research going back decades that suggests that these kinds of considerations influence foreign policy. They can prompt states to behave aggressively. They can, as I argue in my book, prompt states to sort of reject the sort of foundations of international order very broadly in ways that don't really make much sense from a kind of rational realist perspective. And this broad idea, right, that status concerns influence foreign policy is actually a pretty common way of understanding Russian foreign policy, evolution of Russian foreign policy going back to the 90s. Now, two caveats. One is that explaining is not justifying, right? So this is something that I think is important to say because right now, especially if you're sort of explaining what Putin is doing, you might be accused of justifying it. That's not what I'm doing.
I've noticed that. Believe me.
Have you? Yes, I can believe it. So that's not what's happening here, right? I just think it's valuable to understand. The second caveat is that I don't study Russian foreign policy. Other people do, though, and I have certainly read a very large number of people who are experts on Russian foreign policy and have made this argument that status concerns are at the center of the evolution of sort of Russian belligerence over the last couple of decades. So this argument takes a variety of forms. It typically goes back to the sort of couple of years after the fall of the Soviet Union. And the argument basically is not that Russian elites like Putin want to restore the Soviet Union, but rather that they're interested in restoring the role that the Soviet Union played in the world, and especially its status as a superpower, as an equal to the United States. And sometimes this argument makes reference to missteps, foibles, that the United States and its allies and partners made during especially the 90s. So NATO expansion, I actually want to put a pin in this and talk about Mearsheimer's argument in a bit, kind of contrast that a little bit more. But the argument is that NATO expansion infringed on a sort of sphere of influence that had been Russian historically. And that was a signal that Russia was not sort of being taken seriously as a great power anymore. Kimberly Martin argues that more significant than NATO expansion actually was NATO military interventions in the Balkans that proceeded without consultation with the Russians.
Kosovo, in particular, in 1999, I would think the Bosnia intervention had the support of the UN Security Council, so Russia could have vetoed that if they had wanted.
Right, but 1999 very significant because this is again sort of a historically Russian sphere of influence that the U.S. and NATO are intervening in without Russian cooperation, and so the idea, the argument basically is, again, various versions of this argument, but that the sort of liberal reformers, people like Andrei Kozyrev, are disadvantaged politically by these sort of assertions of Western primacy, and that contributes to their sort of defeat and the renewed rise to power of sort of nationalists, right?
Okay, so that I want to get into that dynamic eventually, but let's back up a little. And just when you said status considerations can lead to aggressive behavior or to a rejection of the world order, I assume you mean kind of generically when states feel they're not getting the status they believe they deserve is not being recognized by other states.
That's right. And so in my book, I distinguish between sort of status dissatisfaction, which is where you think you have a lower status than you deserve, and you're going to work to try to improve your image, to sort of gain recognition in other states' eyes of that higher status. And status immobility, which is when you've been trying to do that and you're getting signals that it won't work. Status dissatisfaction leads to status seeking behavior. So this depends on the context, but can involve sort of, right, during the late 19th century, early 20th century, building an empire to try to sort of, right, this is the Japan case study where Japan sort of trying to sort of count as a Western great power. But the dimension, the sort of salient dimension of comparison can shift because these things are socially constructed. Status immobility actually leads to a kind of rejection of the idea that you can gain status, and rather to kind of behavior that is aimed at signaling rejection and defiance of the international order, not necessarily instrumentally, right? For domestic political purposes, because it's emotionally satisfying.
When you say not necessarily instrumentally, you mean not necessarily to influence the behavior of other states, but
right.
In response to either domestic political incentives. In other words, this kind of acting out behavior will play well with your domestic audience, or because you personally emotionally feel insulted. You are the leader of the state, and you feel insulted. Now, I would think Russia doesn't quite exactly fit. Now I've forgotten the label of the second category, but in any event, it's. I mean, it has been seeking kind of status preservation in a sense, and yet has seen its status in the eyes of the world decline. I'm talking about since the end of the Cold War. Now, that doesn't exactly fit either of your models, does it?
No, I mean, the book is about rising powers, right?
Okay.
And so Russia's a sort of declining power. Now, the similar dynamics might apply.
Okay.
And I would say that I guess I would disagree with you a little bit. I don't think that Russia's been seeking the maintenance of its status so much as the restoration of its status.
Okay.
And let's not overdraw this comparison, but there is a case in the book of a state sort of seeking the restoration of its status. Now, it's in the context of a material increase in capabilities. That's Weimar Nazi Germany, right? So it's this sort of reaction to defeat in World War I,
right,
that leads to this sort of revanchism, right? That might be more like what Russia is, but I still, there's a reason that the Russia case isn't in the book, and it's because the theory's scoped to rising powers, and Russia doesn't really count as a rising power.
Okay. So, to that extent, I'm sure you want to qualify your remarks about Russia with the fact that you haven't written a whole book about it, but it did, Putin's speech got, I mean, clearly, first of all, I think you made an interesting distinction earlier that he doesn't necessarily want to restore the Soviet Union, because some people are saying he does, that, it's Hitler level expansionism all over again. And who knows which NATO country is on the list and so on. You're saying it's not necessarily that, but probably he would like to see the level of respect that had been accorded the Soviet Union. He wants a Soviet level of status. And, so his speech, was just even Russians commented on how emotional he was, as if he was taking it personally. That's very consistent with your model, and not so much with the model of a realist, or at least a realist would have trouble accommodating everything about that speech. I think, including the tone. Would that be your view?
I think that a realist might say one of two things. One would be that it doesn't matter because talk is cheap, so why are we paying attention to what people say in public? And the other would be maybe there's some strategic benefit in terms of signaling. He's not a realist, but there's a guy named Todd Hall at Oxford who's written about emotional diplomacy, right? So it might be that sort of anger is useful diplomatically.
Right.
Again, right? I would need. I don't think we can make a judgment right now, but I think what you're saying is quite plausible, right? That this is reflective of an actual emotional reaction.
And I guess, I mean, your model has somewhat different predictive implications, right? Like, when people get emotional about status, and we don't know what's going on in his head, to what extent it was performative, but you're saying it can happen, that leaders just get emotional. They personally identify with what they see as an insult, and they react that way. Well, we know that people in real life can really lash out, can depart from a cool, calculating framework. So, and when you look at the magnitude of the invasion, as to the extent that we can even discern it now, it seems to me, well, I don't know. You tell me. How do you process that? I mean, one expectation had been, well, he goes into the Donbass, maybe pushes the borders of those regions to the nominal extent of those two provinces, which would be a lot of fighting, but it wouldn't be, landing by sea and in a couple of places that apparently troops have landed. How is this looking to you?
Oh, I mean, it looks a lot bigger than that, and I'll tell you, I think that this is where you're going. I think that there's a tendency, I have noticed a tendency to attribute to Putin a sort of level of strategic genius and calculation that I'm not sure is warranted. And as late as a couple of days ago, when he recognized the Donbass, people were sort of talking about how this is so smart. It's sort of typical salami slicing. The scope of the invasion definitely looks bigger. Now, I cannot pretend to know what's going to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if we find out when we actually get to study this in more depth that this was not well planned out, that it looked fairly obviously like a strategic error, and that there wasn't really a good sort of really a good understanding of how this was going to go. And that would suggest
an error in the sense of the international consequences eventually.
So if this is the prelude to like a full scale invasion and sort of regime change, right? Which is what I read, when I read denazification, I don't know how else to understand that than that.
Well, he said both. He said decommunization. That was, but see, well, we don't need to get too deep in the woods, but that was interesting because to me that suggested I want the Russian speaking parts of the mainly Russian speaking parts of Ukraine, because he was saying it was the communists who had glued together this false state. But you're right. If he has said denazification? He did.
Yeah, he did.
I mean, we should say that as we speak, and this won't be posted quite immediately, but the invasion is large in the sense that there have been airstrikes kind of everywhere. Now, so far as I know, those are on military targets, and so that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see troops everywhere. I continue to doubt we will, but by the time this airs, I may look like a fool for saying this, but in any event, why don't you proceed with what you were saying?
Well, all I was gonna say was, again, I agree with you. I don't know where this is going, right? It could be that it's going to be over quickly, and it's really just sort of about the Donbass, or it could be bigger. If it's bigger, I don't necessarily think so. What I meant when I said could turn out to be a strategic error, yeah, maybe, but sort of, it's certainly in terms of the international reaction. But what are you going to do if you occupy Ukraine, right? You're sort of going to be facing a massive insurgency, and I'm not sure how well that's going to go. So that seems like biting off more than you'd want to chew.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it could go bad in a bunch of ways.
I agree. That would be a big mistake, I think, and that's the kind of thing you might attribute in your paradigm to his having gotten personally involved in the status issue.
Possibly.
At a psychological level. It's like the world has been insulting him personally in some sense in his mind, which is not unusual. It's not unusual for leaders to identify with the state. I'm sure the identification can be stronger if it's not a state where you have a new leader every 4 or 8 years and a guy is, gets kind of used to it. Okay, so that's interesting. Now, what about the whole the run up to this? How has that been looking to you? Of course, to provide a little historical perspective, there were people who warned in the 90s, including George Kennan and Jack Matlock, who had been the ambassador to the Soviet Union, that NATO expansion was a huge mistake and could ultimately lead to a reaction by Russia that would be very unfortunate. On the other hand, realists were saying that, because they say, look, it's a national security threat to Russia. If you put them, yourself in their shoes, you wouldn't tolerate what you consider an adversary's military this close to your borders. I would guess that there similar cautions might arise from your point of view, but they'd be different in how right there, at some level there's a difference. What is the difference in your?
Yeah. So first, I just want to note a couple of other notable names who warned against NATO expansion. Right. And again, I think this is important because we often sort of hear about the appeasers, right? And these are just doves. No, Robert McNamara, right, signed the public letter to the Clinton administration, and Paul Nitze was also warning against NATO expansion. These are not doves, right? Paul Nitze was the architect of the massive buildup in defense spending after the Korean War, and Robert McNamara, of course, oversaw the escalation in Vietnam. So there's a whole sort of range of people that were warning for various reasons that NATO expansion was not a great idea. Now, on the realist argument, I mean, I think that both of these sort of dynamics might be working. Right. So it might be that that NATO expansion is both a sort of understood as a material threat, a physical threat to Russian security, and that it is an encroachment on what some Russians have seen as a right that should be accorded to them by virtue of their status. Those can both be working in the same direction. And that, that's, partly, why you carefully think about case selection when you're writing an academic study is to try to figure out how you can distinguish between these dynamics. I mentioned that I have some disagreements with Mearsheimer. I mean, I think Mearsheimer's his argument is plausible, right? I think the notion that NATO expansion has driven sort of Russian belligerence is certainly plausible, but it's interesting. And I know you've talked to Mearsheimer at least once. I don't think that this is entirely consistent with the tenets of offensive realism, right? Because if you read Tragedy of Great Power Politics, that's his
book,
his famous book from 2000. A very well-written book. And Mearsheimer is a wonderfully clear speaker and writer. In some ways too clear, right? Because these kind of inconsistencies become obvious. But what Tragedy of Great Power Politics suggests is that variation in insecurity is really insignificant as a driver of foreign policy, right? That the security dilemma is kind of constantly severe.
Can we pause and explain the security dilemma?
Yeah, sorry.
So that's the idea that things we think of as defensive, and a good example are these anti-missile defenses we've installed in Poland, 100 miles from the Russian border. Now we think of that as defensive because they intercept missiles. And in fact, we say they're directed toward Iranian missiles, although I think obviously from Russia's point of view, it doesn't escape your attention that they could be directed at Russian missiles. And even if we do think of them as defensive, they have offensive implications, because if we were going to attack Russia, they would be very useful in neutralizing the retaliation. So the security dilemma is the idea that one state does something just to shore up its security, but that is, and it doesn't have to be a misperception on the other side. They don't even misunderstand the motivation. They may just go, well, okay, fine, but you realize that if there's a hostile regime in your country in 2 years, they now are more of an offensive threat to us by virtue of your defensive preparations and so on. And so it goes back and forth. So the other side responds with their defensive/offensive preparations and so on. So there's this cycle, and the security dilemma drives these arms races. So now
that's right. Now, important to understand, there's two takes on the security dilemma. There's the defensive realist take, right? The defensive realist take is that the severity of the security dilemma varies according to different factors like geography, right? If you're an island state, then you're going to face weaker security dilemma dynamics than a continental state. Technology as well, right? Back in the 90s, there was this sort of wildly popular literature about the offense-defense balance, basically the idea that some weapon systems are intrinsically offensive and other weapon systems are intrinsically defensive. And so if that distinction is clear, then a security seeker can signal that they're a security seeker by investing in defensive weapons, and then the security dilemma won't operate, right? Mearsheimer's take, offensive realism, is different. Mearsheimer's take suggests that because of anarchy, no state can ever feel secure, right? Unless it's
in other words, there is no world government, world police. That's what he means by anarchy.
That's right. That's what he means by anarchy. Because of anarchy, regardless of the state of military technology or geography, geography is a special case. But let's not talk about geography too much because it's not relevant to Russia. But Mearsheimer's argument is that the severity of the security dilemma does not vary, that it is constantly severe. And this is what leads him to suggest that states will take opportunities to expand and expand and expand until they become regional hegemons. That's the only time you're secure, right? Now, notice that the implication there is that NATO expansion shouldn't really have changed Russia's threat perceptions, right? That what Russian foreign policy should be responsive to is variation in its relative capabilities, which means regardless of what's going on with NATO expansion, as Russia gets wealthier and more powerful, it's going to behave more as a revisionist, regardless of sort of NATO expansion, right? So again, does that make sense?
I'm not sure. I may have missed something. So you're when you say variations in, so you say that what you respond to is how things are different today than they were yesterday.
No. Sorry. So according to Mearsheimer, right? According to Mearsheimer's offensive realism, states do not react to states' foreign policies do not react to their perceptions of whether other states pose threats, right? Because they just kind of assume that all states pose threats, right? What drives variation in the quality of foreign policy is how powerful you are. Right. So as you get more powerful, then you get more expansive. Right.
Yeah.
And so what that means is that an explanation for Russian foreign policy, for say the increase in the belligerence of Russian foreign policy, that is consistent with the logic of offensive realism, would focus more on changes in the relative balance of capabilities between Russia and the United States than it would on the expansion of NATO.
I see. So in that scenario, if Russia's relative power declined, and this is tricky because, with a lot of nuclear weapons, there's at some level it never does, but in conventional terms, maybe it has and so on. But anyway, you're saying that he should say that as Russia's relative power declines, it just accepts the fact and has correspondingly lesser ambitions for regional dominance.
Well, its ambitions maybe don't change, but its ability to act on them does.
And because it's a rational actor, it recognizes that in his model.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And you're saying no, but there's a loss of status, and people don't handle those well.
Yeah, and we shouldn't assume that that everybody's rational. We shouldn't assume that anybody's rational, right?
Yeah.
We shouldn't assume, that there's a tendency to assume that security motives are always the most, the sort of most important first explanation that we should reach for. And I'm just not sure that that's true. And so, for instance, it strikes me that, Putin has talked about security, right? Putin has talked about NATO expansion posing a security threat. It strikes me that that could just be rhetoric covering another motive, right? But IR scholars tend not to take that notion seriously.
Right. Okay, so I see the distinction you're making. So you're arguing that your model actually works better than Mearsheimer's in explaining,
well, again, it's not
recent Russian in the last couple of decades of Russian behavior.
And it's not my model, right? This is because my model doesn't necessarily strictly apply to Russia, but the sort of general notion that status concerns matter, which has been applied to Russia by all these other people, yes.
Okay. So the distinction we made between a person kind of like say Putin identifying with Russia so strongly that this is all personal on the one hand, and domestic political incentives on the other, that seems to me a kind of a subtle matter, and certainly both can be going on at once, right? I mean, and there's the domestic considerations kind of subdivides into Russians are authentically, without any prompting from him, reacting, and then he follows that reaction. That's one extreme, and the other one is he kind of because he does control the kind of TV media, he kind of manipulates, or at least he heavily influences. I don't really know the details, but he kind of manipulates their perception. And for that matter, look, politicians in all countries try to manipulate perceptions to some extent. But and in this case, there are ethnic Russians in Ukraine or kind of native Russian speaking people, who are in a conflict and in a kind of a civil war situation. And the government has done things, I gather, like reduce the role of the Russian language in schools and media, close some, make it harder for some Russian language, at least some Russian language media outlets to operate. So all of this, on the one hand, you can imagine just kind of a response at the popular level without orchestration. On the other hand, it's a convenient thing for him, especially if like his economy's not doing that great and so on. Yeah. If he can stir this up, you would expect that to help him politically, right? So I would think this all gets very complicated in the model, right? The distinction among these things.
I mean, ultimately so whether this is leader driven or leader reacting to important domestic constituencies driven is an empirical question, right? And so again, I'm just going to have to say, I don't have enough knowledge, and I don't think we have enough knowledge of the state of play in Russia to actually tell the difference, right? I think in some historical cases you can make a better case, but in this case it's just ongoing. It's tough. Now, of course, and the sort of diversionary incentive that you mentioned, that's kind of separate, right? Because that suggests that this is not ultimately about, that's a kind of a tangentially related literature, right? This notion that that leaders wag the dog, right? That and it's not, Clinton was accused of doing this after the Lewinsky scandal broke, right? That leaders provoke crises to distract attention from domestic scandals or domestic crises. I think that's a slightly different dynamic. I think it can interact with status concerns. It might be that sort of outstanding status ambitions or status gripes might prove useful to leaders who need to divert, right? That's possible, right? These are all kind of extensions of this very general model.
Okay. You mentioned that you get, a couple of kinds of, acting out is not the technical term, I'm sure, but responses to to perceived status, an asymmetry of status perception between you and the outside world. One of them is aggressive behavior, We are arguably, I mean, we're definitely seeing aggressive behavior. It's arguably attributable to that dynamic. The other you said is not accepting the world order. Now, Putin gave a speech in 2007, the Munich conference speech. Are you familiar with that? When he kind of he complained like about the U.S.'s violation of international law and the expansion of NATO, and it was a kind of a he was kind of. I mean, he was kind of, the subtext was almost like, there's a world order I'm willing to live with, but the U.S. doesn't seem willing to. The U.S. is violating international law, which was true. Iraq invasion, I think fairly clearly Kosovo wasn't on the side of international law, that intervention. I wonder if you're conversant in that speech and have thought about it in terms of your mind, and then just to flesh this out, then in 2008, after he delivered a warning that got a certain amount of attention, George W. Bush convinces Europe that NATO has to promise membership to Ukraine and Georgia. So it was almost, I mean, talk about that a little, like that in your model, as opposed to maybe a realist model. So he gives this warning and Bush just gives him the back of his hand, basically, right? I mean, that's kind of the natural perception.
Yeah. So I should say one thing, which is that, so the book, right, the sort of theory that's laid out in the book is about rising powers and development of different kinds of revisionism. But it is also true that hegemons can be revisionist. So I've done other work with some co-authors that sort of thinks about, for instance, the United States as a revisionist. And so the U.S., right, that's absolutely right, especially under the Bush administration. The U.S. was a sort of clearly behaving as a revisionist, not.
And revisionist means what? Trying to kind of change the rules, or what? What exactly?
Well, it can mean different things. So a revisionist is just a state that wants to change something. You can think about different kinds of revisionists. A distributive, what I call a distributive or positional revisionist, is a state that wants to shift some element of a distribution of resources in its favor, so territory, power, right, wealth. And a normative revisionist is a state that wants to change something about the rules, right? So international institutions or norms, right? What I write about in my book is this sort of convergence of these two kinds of revisionism, which I call radical revisionism. So these are states that are both dissatisfied with the distribution of some significant good and are dissatisfied with this sort of broader institutional order. And I suggest in the book that these are quite dangerous states. But again, right, the point is hegemon states at the top. It's an interesting phenomenon, but they can also become quite dissatisfied and act as if they were revisionists. Now, the 2000, so I'm not super familiar with the 2007 speech. I have not done that particular piece of homework for this conversation. But complicated, of course, right? Because Putin, as you mentioned, is right that the U.S. sort of behaving in ways that flout these rules. And I also think that it's right. Anne Clunan has a recent piece, right, for instance, that that suggests that, in fact, Putin is not entirely opposed to the liberal international order. It just depends what you mean by that. Right. If you mean sort of international institutions and kind of rules of the game that are applied kind of consistently, then yeah, he's fine with that. If you mean sort of liberal democracy, then he's not okay with it. This sort of spread of liberal democracy, he's not okay with that. On the 2008, the promise to Georgia and Ukraine, how would I understand that? Yeah, I mean, I think you described it well. It's a sort of a slap in the face, an insult, yet another signal that Russia's sphere of influence is not being respected. Now, whether that ultimately sort of convinces Putin that he faces a kind of what I call in the book a status glass ceiling, that's very hard to say at this point, but it can't have helped.
In other words, the world is imposing a ceiling on how high his status will be recognized, and that's when you get things like, say, what he did in Georgia in 2008. Okay. I'd like to talk a little about China and then move on
Mm.
to, maybe one or two of the historical examples in your book.
Sure.
Maybe in the meanwhile, another question about Russia will occur to me. And if there's anything else you want to first, is there anything else you want to say about Russia from your perspective?
No.
Good. Just good. I hope we've covered, the basics there. So China, rising power.
Yeah.
And so the U.S. in relative economic terms, at least, a declining power. And if you compare, especially, GDP between the two countries, and even per capita GDP, there's a relative, I think, decline. And China is accordingly building up its military. How do you see this? What light does your model shed on this?
Yeah. Basically, if we sort of understand China as a rising power, and we understand China as a state that has outstanding status ambitions, unsatisfied status ambitions, and again, this is pretty common, a pretty common claim that a lot of the things that China has done in the past couple of decades have been aimed at promoting its status, and it's not all aggressive, right? Hosting the Olympics, certainly not about making money. It's about other stuff. And one of the things that hosting the Olympics gets you, in theory anyway, is an increase in status. What my perspective suggests, and there is a chapter in the book about China, it's kind of a speculative chapter, is that it's going to be, so dealing with China's status ambitions is something that the U.S. will have to do in one way or another, and it's not going to be something that is going to be fun. It is going to come down to a very difficult and painful decision, and here's why. So I think that there are people who have suggested that you can kind of accommodate China's status in kind of very superficial ways, by inviting Chinese leaders to conferences, by having face-to-face meetings with them, right? Just kind of treat them like they're important and you can buy them off. And I don't think that's right. I think that what China wants is what Russia wants, is what the US has. And that is the trappings of great powerness. And in the book, I argue that this has to do largely with the right to a sort of sphere of influence, where the great powers got a right to intervene without okaying it with anyone else. That's arguably what Russia wants in its near abroad. That's arguably the US has that all over the world. And that is, I think, what China wants in the South and East China Seas. And what this means is that the maintenance of US primacy, if we understand that to mean the persistence of forward deployed American troops just off China's shore, is going to be inconsistent with that claim. And so this means that you're either going to be in for a protracted period of kind of conflict, not necessarily open conflict, but conflict, between a rising status dissatisfied and potentially radically revisionist China at some point, and the United States, or the US is going to have to downsize its global footprint in East Asia, which would mean very painfully abandoning security commitments that we have there. I think especially Taiwan.
Yeah, well, Taiwan is kind of a special case because we ourselves have acknowledged historically that it's not exactly like a regular sovereign country, and there's a special issue involving China there. But if you look at something like Japan or South Korea, I don't think you're suggesting that China wants to actually invade those countries.
No. It's not about sort of actually invading those countries. It is rather about it is rather about exercising its own primacy in that area, which I think is inconsistent with the maintenance of, right? I mean, this is the whole conflict between air-sea battle. I actually don't, it's called joint concept for command of the commons or something like that right now. And what's known as AAAD, right? China's been developing the military capabilities to make it difficult for the United States to operate offshore, and that's prompting a response from the US and on and on and on, right? My perspective suggests that what's implicated here is not just security concerns, but also status concerns. That having a global hegemon sort of dominating that region.
Yeah. Because I've got to say, I have kind of wondered in the just national security model, what exactly the argument about is about in a certain sense, because I think what what you're suggesting is that they don't want U.S. ships in their in their neighborhood. Damn it! And it's pretty like much. They want that because they want to change the rules fundamentally. In other words, they want freedom of navigation, right? Freedom of commercial navigation is in their interest. They trade a lot, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in other words, is there a clear, real security reason they don't want ships off their waters? Now, of course, the answer occurs to me as I ask the question. Countries tend to be a little on the paranoid side. I mean, the U.S. is complaining about China maybe establishing a military base in Africa, for God's sake, right? Not an immediate threat exactly. Countries just tend to have higher sensitivity on this front than may seem justified in national security terms from abroad. But in other words, is there a distinction? Do you think the realists don't do a great job of predicting what China is asking for in the nearby waters?
I mean, which realists?
Right. I mean, and I don't really know the territory well enough to say, I guess, but we can skip the question. I mean, is there anything at all you want to? So you're saying?
So I'll just say. Let me just add one thing here. So two things. I find the notion that China would be threatened by the U.S. Navy being enforced off its shore quite plausible and reasonable, right? I mean, I think the U.S. would be similarly threatened if there were permanent Chinese or Russian naval installations in the Gulf of Mexico. On the other hand, there are certain security benefits to the presence of large numbers of American troops in Japan and South Korea, and that is that those countries are disincentivized from securing themselves. Right. And so what that means is that maybe, and this is kind of part of the theory behind some of the sort of arguments for deep engagement. Bill Walforth has written with John Eikenberry, who I think was on the show, right? Eikenberry is not a realist, but he and Walforth came together to write this sort of defense of deep engagement. Basically, the idea is this sort of the U.S. security blanket, right? The U.S. has 30,000 troops in Korea and tens of thousands of troops in Japan. And what that means is that these countries don't need to worry about arming themselves. And that might mean that you have a lower probability of regional arms races turning into conflicts, right? And that's good for China, right? The other thing I wanted to mention is just this, so this issue related to freedom of navigation, right? And so it strikes me that this is not obviously about security, at least from the U.S.'s perspective. So these freedom of navigation operations, these phone ops, right, where the U.S. drives a ship through a piece of a part of the ocean that China claims as its own, right, in contravention of the UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And what's it doing, right? Nothing. It's sort of like your little brother said, "You can't touch me," and he just says, "Don't touch me," and you say like, "Touch, touch, touch," right? That's really all it's doing. That and like raising the risk of an unintended escalation of a crisis.
Yeah. So the I guess I guess what seems to be the case is, realists tend to say, look, China, as it rises, is going to want more and more control over its neighborhood. You are reinforcing that prediction, basically. Your model, to some extent, converges with the realist model in saying, yeah, you better figure out how you want to respond to this, because the problem's not going away.
Yeah, I would say some realists, right? Mearsheimer, yes. Mearsheimer would predict that as China gets more powerful, it will try to dominate its region. Not all realists, right? Defensive realists don't necessarily think that.
Okay.
And I think the main distinction is the model of how U.S. reactions might influence Chinese behavior, right? Where my model is sort of interested in social psychology, emotions, and domestic politics, and suggests that sometimes foreign policy behavior might be what we'd call irrational and realist. So, for instance, a realist might say the proper approach here is to strengthen the U.S. capacity, U.S. military capacity in East Asia, because that'll deter the Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And I would maybe, but it might also produce these kinds of sort of destructive dynamics that I write about in the book.
Okay. I'm wondering, is the, one thing China complains about is the U.S. raising human rights issue, most notably the Uyghurs, perhaps, Hong Kong in a different way. Is that perceived as a status question? Or?
I think it has been. Yeah, I think it certainly has been. And again, like this, so if you were trying to accommodate China, you would want to not raise those issues.
Well, that seems clear. I mean, they're telling us that, and they seem to mean it. But but you see it as, to some extent, an expression of status consciousness.
I think that Chinese leaders have seen this as an expression of as an indication that their status is not being taken seriously.
Right.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on the psychology of Xi Jinping, possibly compared to the psychology of Vladimir Putin? He comes off as a pretty cool operator, to me at least. It's like there are things that really bothered them, but he didn't personally throw a fit. It's like like when Blinken and I guess Jake Sullivan went over to China at the beginning of the Biden administration, they got real blowback. But that was clearly kind of, when they raised human rights issues and so on, but that clearly was kind of planned and orchestrated. Xi Jinping didn't get involved. It's like their foreign minister is supposed to give us a dressing down. Those are, do you have any armchair psychology thoughts about Xi Jinping versus Putin?
No, I try to stay out of armchair psychology. So no, I don't have any special insights. And again, I just would highlight the possibility that both Xi Jinping and Putin could very well be manipulating emotional responses strategically. That could be the case.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Now, it seems to me, on the other side of the table, there's America's conception of the status it deserves. And it seems that Russia and China are kind of different cases, because after the Cold War, if the U.S., what the people who criticize American policy after the Cold War toward Russia are saying is, all you had to do is not expand NATO. You didn't have to shrink NATO.
Yeah.
Whereas with China, you're saying, no, we're going to have to shrink our presence if we don't want certain kinds of friction that may or may not lead to trouble. Right. Those are, I mean, first of all, I'm just pointing out there's a difference there, but also the status considerations today, in your mind, they apply equally to how America handles these things.
Absolutely. I think that there is actually, I was just reading something actually for a class that I'm teaching about the sort of social psychology of exceptionalism, right? So, American exceptionalism is right, this notion that the U.S. is kind of exempt from historical rules, special somehow, right? That this reinforces the notion of the kind of importance of being at the top in terms of status, And there are reasons to think that being at the top might make you more sensitive to status loss, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it actually might make you more prone to overreacting to things that seem to be threats to your status. There are, I think, there's a plausible reading of the Iraq War that is a kind of reaction to a perception of threatened or lost status.
Yeah,
kind of
like who do you think you are to be blowing up our buildings?
Yeah,
you're just a ragtag bunch of terrorists, and we're the United States,
and we need to show the world how big and tough we are.
Yeah, which that itself could have other that could have realist explanations. So anyway, there's a it's funny. I was just talking to somebody. I think it was part of the recording of a show that hasn't aired yet, but he was saying, Bill Clinton, after he was president, said, America, it's inevitable that it experience a relative decline in power. So it is in its interest to try to reinforce the rules of the road, international law, and so on. If you're no longer going to be the king of the jungle, you don't want it to be a jungle. But he, according to the person I was talking to, Clinton never said it while he was president, because it would have been political suicide. In fact, he never said it after this. This was 2003, I think. And he said, people even then said, oh, you can't say that. Right. Yeah. So this is about, kind of just accepting parts of American status psychology as just fixed in cement, right? They can't be altered. Any politician messes with them to his or her peril, right? Like that's, in other words, the advice Clinton was being given to not talk this way was advice about how to handle America's status psychology.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's right. And obviously that's unfortunate and quite dangerous, right? Because it might be the case that if you think that material decline is inevitable, the best way to manage it is to plan far in advance and to make sure that you don't have these hotspots, these crisis centers blowing up as a result of friction with rising powers. Your own kind of status complexes are going to get in the way of that sort of long-term management.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of the historical examples in your book. As for Weimar psychology, it seems kind of clear cut, right? I mean, Hitler very explicitly talked about how Germany was not being respected. Its former greatness had been lost. I think Putin-Hitler comparisons are overdrawn, but there is that in common, right?
Yeah, and I think, I didn't, in the book, I really didn't get into Hitler's psychology. I just didn't want to touch it. But
I'm not even talking about his psychology per se. I'm talking about the appeals he was making to his people.
He was, and they were popular on the right, right? And the argument in the book is that by the late 20s, early 30s, those arguments had contributed to the Nazis becoming the largest conservative party in Germany, the largest right-wing party in Germany, which is obviously a precondition for Hitler becoming chancellor.
Mm-hmm. The conventional wisdom there is, if we had treated Germany differently after World War I, there might not have been such a big problem. If the victorious Allies had laid down different terms of peace and otherwise behaved differently, there might not have, Hitler was probably going to be Hitler. I don't know, but I mean, there might not have been so much popular support for his message.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think that, right. That the problem with Versailles was that it tried to cut a middle path between punishing Germany, making sure that Germany physically could not challenge the status quo again ever, and appeasing Germany, and it didn't do either, right? So it treated Germany like a pariah state without imposing on it the kinds of burdens that you would want to impose on it in order to make sure that it could never again challenge the European status quo.
Mm-hmm. And then I think pretty much standard view is that after World War II, we had kind of learned that lesson, and, the Marshall Plan and so on. We did not inflict humiliation on Germany or punishing economic penalties, and that worked out better. That's the way
I mean, I think it was,
you see that as post World War II, we handled status issues better.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't write about this in the book. The post World War II Germany is not in the book, but my sense would be that the occupation of Germany was far more comprehensive after the Second World War. And yeah, maybe the status issues were dealt with differently. I haven't really thought about that. That's interesting. But obviously, like, Germany's occupied pretty comprehensively by multiple great powers after the Second World War for a time.
That's true. Okay. And then pre-World War I Germany, how does that play out?
Yeah. So the argument there is that what the status that Germany wants is world power status, Weltpolitik, and they so this kind of means equality with Great Britain. And one of the things that they want is for the British to sort of recognize that they count in the same category by kind of taking their interests seriously around the world, and especially by kind of recognizing that Germany has a right to naval equality, and that's something that the British were not willing to do. And this is a case where you do see, the Kaiser Wilhelm II, his psychology is quite interesting, and he's evidence that he's quite angry on a number of occasions at the British for these slights, and that this contributes by 1912, 1913 to a determination to challenge the European status, the European balance of powers, sort of drive for European hegemony, rather than competing for sort of world power status, which involved kind of empire building and naval competition.
Okay. And then Japan now. So we'll talk about that a little. This is during what period are you focusing on Japan?
So early 1930s. So the case study of Japan goes back into the late 19th century. Basically, the story is that Japan wants to be a Western great power, right? It wants to be sort of a full member of the Great Power Club with all the rights that come along with that. And over time, it becomes clear that that's not going to be possible, and that this has to do with race. That the Japanese are not treated in the same way as white European great powers, and the U.S. obviously, right? And that by the early 1930s, this leads to a number of Japanese policymakers and domestic groups to conclude that Japan can't be treated fairly within the sort of Western world order. And the instantiation of this that I focus on most in the book is Japan's withdrawal from the League of Nations after the Mukden incident and the start of the war in Manchuria.
So what led Japan to perceive that it wouldn't be allowed to join the club? What did it take as the big signs of disrespect?
So there were a number over the preceding decades. So there were sort of immigration disputes, especially with the United States, but also with, say, Australia, over the kind of treatment of Japanese immigrants in these countries, right? In some cases, these were policies implemented by states. For instance, California passed a law in 1913 that banned Japanese from owning land. That pissed the Japanese off. There were kind of other disputes over immigration that made the Japanese kind of nervous about their status within the Western world order. So much so that in the years after World War I, the Japanese went to the Paris peace conference and demanded that a racial equality clause be written into the League of Nations Charter, the Paris Peace Treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, and it wasn't. Woodrow Wilson made sure that it wasn't. He had diplomatic reasons to do that. He had domestic political reasons to do that. But it wasn't written in, and that was another kind of sort of piece of evidence against the kind of Western world order. The Washington Naval Conference in the early 20s gave Japan, officially put Japan on a lower level than the British and the Americans. I have my book right here. Actually, this is the cover of the book. So
explain the cover. So
so the Punch cartoon,
553, and is that a cartoon from Punch?
It's a cartoon from Punch. This is John Bull. This is Uncle Sam, and this is a Japanese sailor here.
And for the audio listeners, they are sitting on the digits respectively 5, 5, and 3.
And so this was the naval tonnage ratio that was written into the Washington Naval Treaty. So the Japanese got 3 tons for every 5 tons that the Americans and the British got. That didn't make them happy. And then the kind of last straw was after the Mukden incident, the League of Nations kind of investigated what had happened and rejected Japan's claims about having acted in self-defense. Of course, Japan hadn't acted in self-defense. They'd precipitated the attack. But this led to outrage, and to a determination to leave the League of Nations.
And do you have a view on kind of, you might say, how long historical memory is? So, for example, with China, you hear sometimes that, this goes back to the Opium Wars, the imposition of Britain's power on China and so on. And is that kind of part of your model that yes, countries like people remember slights from long ago and act accordingly?
Yeah, it can be. I would say it's not formally part of the model, but it absolutely can be a contributing factor. I think that the answer to the question of how long historical memory is not one that can be answered generally, because it depends on what kinds of stories people are telling, right? And that's going to determine how long the historical memory is. There are other people who have done work on not interspatial status comparisons, but rather temporal status comparisons. So status dissatisfaction can be driven not by the notion that I don't have enough status relative to you, but that I don't have enough status relative to a past self that had more status.
Right.
So that's another area of status research.
Yep. That seems like a real thing, at least in individual human psychology. Okay, well, is there anything else you want to say about any of this, the book or Russia or anything?
No, this has been obviously it's a terrible day, but this has been a nice conversation. So.
Yeah, okay, well, let's remind people the name of the book, Status and the Challenge of Rising Powers by Stephen Ward, which is you, Cambridge University Press. Are you on Twitter? Do you have any other thing you want to...
I am on Twitter.
What's your handle?
Boy, I can't even remember. I don't tweet very much.
Mostly
it's pictures of food. At Stephen_M_Ward is me on Twitter.
That's Stephen with a V.
Yes.
And I'm at Robert Writer, WRIGHTER, and write stuff in the Nonzero newsletter. Well, thanks so much, Stephen. I think, it's your perspective makes sense to me, based on the behavior of both individuals and nations. So, and that's, I guess, all you'd ask.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.